Everyone, welcome to our ECS Lunch and Learn hosted by the Ecosystem and Climate Science team. I'm Sharon Lam, a research scientist in Ecosystem and Climate Science, and I'm pleased to be your host today. As TRCA staff would know, this is part of our regular ECS Lunch and Learn series that aims to help support knowledge transfer within the organization and at times beyond by bringing you topics that may be of interest to staff across teams and divisions. Today, we're excited to be joined by Maryam Iler, Senior Manager in Restoration and Infrastructure, John Ford, Senior Manager in Hydrogeology, Brynn Coey, Supervisor in Aquatic Monitoring and Management, and Brian Ford, Biologist in Terrestrial Inventories and Monitoring. Before we begin, here's some quick housekeeping notes. The presentation slides and a video recording of today's session will be shared with all of you following the event. If you're experiencing any technical issues, please let me know in the chat or send me a quick message. All participants are muted to minimize noise, and so if you have any questions for our speakers, please type your questions in the chat or use the raise your hand function during the Q&A if you would like to speak. With that, I'll pass the floor now to Maryam to start us off.
All right, thanks so much, Sharon, and welcome everyone. It's my pleasure to be here today with a few other members of our Portlands project team. So I've been the project manager for TRCA for the Portlands for the past 6 years. And with me on the line is Don Ford, who is also part of the original Portlands project team and is going to talk a bit about the history and the legacy of brownfields development that is behind the Portlands. And Brynn Coey and Brian Ford, who've been with the project for a couple of years, and they are going to talk a little bit about the EA monitoring phase. So I said I'm going to talk about the current state and how we got here, a little bit about the Indigenous involvement. Don will cover some of the brownfields legacy of the Portlands, and then we'll move on to the EA monitoring phase, which has been happening for a few years now and is going to continue over the long term to the future. It gives you an idea of where we're going with the Portlands. So first of all, I'm excited to be able to introduce to you the newest river mouth in the city of Toronto with the newest river channel for the Don. It's been flowing now for a few weeks. And in creating this new river channel, we've also created the city's newest island, which has been officially named Ukwemin-Minising. And I'm sure there's someone on this call who could probably pronounce that better than I can, but it is translates from the local Indigenous languages quite loosely into place of the black cherry trees. Just wanted to give you a couple of shots, air photos of the site. So this is looking west across the new river channel. Keep your eye on the building on the right. I can't point to it, but you'll see there's an old fire hall there as a reference point. And the next slide shows us looking south over what's called the ice management area and south towards the ship channel. Right there you see Commissioner Street with the new bridges in place. And then looking east, so you'll have the old fire hall there on the left, on the north side of the river, just as a reference. And you can see in the foreground there, you can see the pedestrian bridge over the channel and then the other new road bridge there. Just going to point out that the river has the banks have been planted and things are looking quite green. And this was even just in October. And so by spring, I think it's going to be very exciting to see how the new habitats take shape. But it's been a long road to get to this point. It goes back in terms of the EAs, which were the Lower Don and then the Don Mouth Naturalization EAs. And that's almost 10 years ago that process started. But in reality, the move to renaturalize the mouth of the Don goes back even to the 1980s. And Don Ford is going to talk a little bit about the brownfields legacy that spurred all of this movement. So I won't talk about that, but I will just mention that, there's been a long process with a lot of players to get to this point. It took a lot of funding commitments to be able to get to this stage where we could have shovels in the ground to have this construction. And we don't have time to go into all that today, but if you would like more information about that long road that got us to this point, Waterfront Toronto actually presented to our board last Friday, the 22nd. And in their presentation, there were a lot of there's a lot of information about the history of not only the Don River and the old, marshes and everything itself, but just the history of how we got to this point and all of the players that contributed to getting us to the enabling infrastructure phase. a big part of how we got to this phase, although Waterfront Toronto is the proponent and supported by the City of Toronto, and they were the ones who were in essence holding the purse strings on this, our TRCA team really were instrumental in detailed design in a variety of aspects of getting the Portland's enabling infrastructure stage to this successful opening of the River Valley. And I really want to give a big shout out to all of those people. Some are in this photo here, but they're all mentioned on the slide. In addition to the many field staff, we couldn't possibly list them all here, but they were really the people who are instrumental in helping us get to this phase. And the types of things we were doing during the coordination phase of the project, included things like project management, of course, and governance and reporting and dealing with financials, detailed design and permitting, as of course under a regulatory role, but there were over, I believe, 40 permits, and Sharon could correct me. Sharon Lingertag could correct me at some point, but there were over 40 permits, many of them complex. We all participated in detailed design with all of the technical staff providing excellent input. There was a lot of work done for archaeology and Indigenous engagement, which I'm sure Alistair and Catherine could have a whole separate presentation on that themselves. And then in the later stages over the past couple of years, we've been dealing with all the coordination with the city folks in terms of the long-term operations, maintenance, and surveillance of the Portlands, because it's a huge new green space asset for the city, and dealing with all of the different aspects of property and asset handover issues. And the city has been relying on TRCA for inspections and warranty. And then, of course, we have been doing annual compliance monitoring under the EA as required by the EA since the construction start in 2017. That continues today and will continue until the end of the EA monitoring period in 2029, which Brian and Brynn are going to talk a bit more in a few minutes. And as I mentioned, the city has been relying on TRCA staff because of our excellent technical expertise to assure the city that all of these assets are ready for the city to accept as the new owner of the Portlands going forward. And this slide just shows one of our inspection walks in January 2024. I also wanted to include it because it shows you what the new River Valley was like before it was flooded. So before they pulled the west plug and let the water flow in from the lake, this is you can see the riverbed there, as well as on the sides, all of the different bank stabilization treatments that were installed. So as I mentioned, the Portlands was a large endeavor, as everyone can imagine. It originally consisted of 23 separate sub-projects, and many of those sub-projects required more than one permit. A couple of the scope items were moved out to adjacent projects, particularly flood protection and landform construction, which is now being carried out on the lower side of the street there by Cadillac Fairview, or private sector, and then the Broadview Eastern Flood Protection Project, which is still under TRCA, where we're in detailed design, and that's managed by my colleague in PMO Honolulu. And so the whole purpose of Portlands was really to create all that enabling infrastructure and remove all of these lands, the 290 hectares that were still flood vulnerable lands. So this was the original conditions before the Portlands project started. These were all the areas that would be flooded in eastern downtown Toronto. And the objective was really to get us to this full flood protection state, which is, as you can see, modeled here. And the idea was that, we're going to have this new river channel to carry the majority of the flow. Keating Channel would continue to exist as an overflow. And then there were a number of other features, such as the Dawn Greenway, which would be a spillway and then in high flood condition. And that overall, in addition to the flood protection landforms that would be on the north side of Lakeshore, that would be able to contain the floodwaters and channel them out to the lake, as you see here. So something I just wanted to highlight that is kind of a non-technical aspect, but I think is really interesting about the Portlands because of the scale of how it was done and then the method of how it was accomplished, was Waterfront Toronto's efforts to have true Indigenous engagement and involvement from a variety of Indigenous groups in the design process and just the overall level of consultation that was held for the entirety of the Portlands Enabling Infrastructure Project. So there, as you can see here, Waterfront Toronto conducted direct consultation with a number of different groups. In addition to that, they involved field liaison representatives for the archaeology and in all of the actual on-the-ground field work, where representatives from different groups would come out and work alongside with our staff in the field to learn and to advise and just to share knowledge and bring an Indigenous perspective. And the outcome of this that is going to be available for people to see is really in the parks and public realm aspect. And we don't have time to go into all of the different details here because there are so many. And I think it was really an interesting process, as I mentioned, on probably an unprecedented scale for a project in the city of Toronto. But if you would like to know more about the outcomes of the process and the things that are being constructed now and planned for the future in the public realm, I again encourage you to see the presentation that was made by Waterfront Toronto at our recent board meeting, because Ken went into a lot of the details about some of these design features and all of the thought and the planning that went into them in order to have the finished features on the ground. Even the ideas of some of the bridges, they took some of the placemaking and like cultural references from the Indigenous groups that were consulted and incorporated those into a variety of things. So there were some of the aspects had to do with things like plant communities and how those species were selected, and then whether they have meaning for some of the or historical meaning for some of the Indigenous cultures, and then some of the things that were some of the fun play features and things like that you see that we're eventually going to be in the constructed areas of the public realm. So I think that is all I will say for today, and perhaps I'll pass it on to Don now so that he can talk about the brownfields legacy of the Portlands.
Thanks, Maryam. And it's important to remember that there's a long history of and complex history of industrial land use in this area. This is an air photo, I believe, from about 1970s, 1971. And you can see all the oil tanks in this area. It was the location of one of the first oil refineries in Canada. So long history of a whole variety of industrial activities, including filling of the former Ashbridges Bay wetland and munitions during the war at one point. Munition Street comes by its name, honestly. So a whole variety of different sources of environmental impact. And it happens that the planned river valley went through some of the more contaminated real estate in this area. So all that had to be dealt with before, obviously, we could start constructing the new river valley. These investigations were quite intense, and you can see some of the samples of oil that were collected. There was both what we call dense non-aqueous product, DNAPL, and light non-aqueous product, including oils. So the dense material represents some chlorinated solvents and PAHs. And this made the remediation even more complex, because if you're dealing with floating product, you can just simply dig down to the water table and deal with it. But this went much deeper, because some of this product was either denser than water or about the same density of water, so penetrated much deeper than we thought it might be until the detailed investigations were completed. And all those little green dots are individual boreholes or monitoring wells that were installed. And a lot of innovative technologies were used here as well to help identify the hydrocarbon concentrations, including laser-induced fluorescence, which gives essentially a continuous profile down the borehole. All that fed into what we call the CBRA, or community-based risk assessment. It's also important to realize here that the main environmental legislation that we deal with, Ontario Regulation 15304, is based on land use. And in this case, we're creating a river, and a river is not considered a land use. So some of the standard criteria we would use weren't applicable in this case. Also, we wanted consistent criteria across the project area. So the contractors, consultants, and ourselves in Waterfront Toronto and City of Toronto knew what all the criteria would be clearly before going in to dig the river valley. And This risk assessment identified both risks to human health and the environment, both to the plants, to the fish, and also involved developing measures to mitigate or reduce those risks. So risk management measures, we call them. And overall, a comprehensive strategy was developed for tracking and reusing soil on the site. And you'll see later on the volumes that we're talking about and the importance of having these criteria and having the comprehensive strategy for reducing the amount of soil that had to be trucked off site. This was a summary of the risk assessment process, just for those who might be interested. You start with the exposure assessment, looking at, well, how much time people and receptors might be in this or exposed to these contaminants, and how those exposures might result, whether it's through dermal contact or inhalation, or in the case of fish, consumption of plant matter, or actual picking up of sediment. And then you look at a toxicity assessment. So you have to look at each of those receptors and look at their dose response for each, as we call it, for each of the contaminants of concern, and look at what the adverse effects might be. And then the risk assessment involves that bringing together that exposure and toxicity to look at, hey, do any of these contaminants of concern exceed the target? And if they do, there's some form of risk management measure required. If not, then we don't need a risk management measure. So, as I mentioned earlier, on-site treatment and reuse of soil was critical because there's 150 years of fill placement as well as the industrial activity in this area. A lot of it was low-strength native peat and silt deposits. And we had to collectively excavate 1.4 million cubic meters of material, approximately, and fill about 1.1 million cubic meters. That's a tremendous volume of soil to manage, especially in downtown, traffic considerations with trucks, etc. And along with that, there's also a lot of water treatment needed because this very wet material is located right beside Lake Ontario. So even with various risk management measures in place, significant dewatering was still required and water treatment to minimize how much water had to be trucked off site. So some of the risk management measures included secant pile walls. You can see the image on the upper left. Slurry walls, central top image. Slurry walls are a mix of bentonite and cement that form a more flexible wall. The secant pile walls were put where some structural support was necessary as well. And then there were cases of hybrid slurry walls involving more cement mixtures to make them stronger in certain areas. And finally, we also utilized what's called a diaphragm wall, which is a more continuous concrete pour, much like a house foundation wall, but much deeper. And you can see by the scale of these walls that they extended in some cases down 30 to 35 meters below grade. We also had horizontal barriers. So you can see the river finishes on top, but we had to have a protective layer under that to make sure that if there is some erosion happening in the finishes during a flood event, for example, that it wouldn't get down to the treatment layer, which underlies that protective cover layer. And that was for supplementary risk management in terms of dealing with any hydrocarbons that might get through the geomembrane, 1.5 millimeter thick, high density polyethylene geomembrane. That's the primary horizontal barrier. But there was also below that a geosynthetic clay liner. Why all these protective layers? It shows the degree of contamination that's still present below the river finishes, and it was very necessary to have these horizontal engineered systems in place to ensure that the plants and the animals and the people wouldn't be exposed to any of the contaminants that couldn't be addressed through the remedial processes. Now I'll turn it over to Brynn for the aquatic monitoring to see how successful all these risk management measures were.
Yeah, my name is Brynn, and as Sharon mentioned, I'm a supervisor with the Aquatic Monitoring and Management team. I started at TRCA in 2017, and since then I've had the privilege of working on this project. So today I'll be sharing the aquatic monitoring aspects of the project completed as part of the EEA and how we're tracking progress in our restoration efforts. So to provide a little bit of history, 200 years ago, Lake Ontario's waters were clear and supported a rich diversity of fish species, many of which were found in abundance, but are now much more of a rare sight. Toronto's coastal wetlands offered perfect habitats for species like muskie, northern pike, and walleye. Lake sturgeon were once so common that they spawned in such dense numbers that they blocked river passages, and these fish were often undervalued, discarded, used as fertilizer, or burned to power steamboats due to their abundance. Lake trout and Atlantic salmon also thrived, with Atlantic salmon being so common that they were measured not by the individual fish, but by the barrel. So there are plenty of stories about these once abundant species, but today we rarely see them in such numbers. With the historical context of the Toronto waterfront in mind, the revitalization of the Portlands focuses on restoring habitats that can support diverse and thriving fish communities while addressing modern challenges such as invasive species. So as you can see in this image, the revitalization plan incorporates a variety of aquatic habitats. These habitats will provide quality shelter and foraging opportunities, all while managing the impact of invasive species like carp. Many techniques from the Toronto Waterfront Aquatic Habitat Restoration Strategy, also known as TWARS, were used when creating these new habitats. The creation of the strategy was led by TRCA in 2003 and outlines recommended restoration techniques. With this guiding document, constructed habitat like anchored log tangles, shallow rocky shoals, and gravel for spawning were added within the new river valley wetlands. So TRCA conducts a large portion of the natural environmental monitoring associated with this project. Prior to this construction work starting, the aquatic monitoring team completed electrofishing transects within the project area. We had 253 samples in our database for the 10 years prior to construction at the location shown. 10% of the samples had no fish caught, and for the remainder of the samples, we predominantly caught emerald shiner, gizzard shad, and alewife, all of which are cool water species we frequently see elsewhere along the waterfront. So during the construction of the project, mitigation measures had to be enacted to ensure that harm to fish during construction was limited. One of these mitigation measures is to monitor the area and ensure that construction activities are not limiting the migration of spawning species. So to do this, we have been conducting weekly electrofishing surveys within the Keating Channel and lower downriver in spring and fall every year since 2018 when construction began. We are monitoring that species are able to move upstream past the construction activities to spawn and are not staging at the mouth unable to pass. There are other mitigation measures that the construction crews on site implement on a daily basis, such as sediment control and turbidity monitoring, for example. So although the project is not fully complete, some components of it are. For example, the first sub-project, the Cherry Street Stormwater and Lake Filling Project, was completed in November 2019, and we've already completed the post-performance monitoring for this part of the project. So this is what the area looked like in 2017. Esrock Key was located near the end of the Keating Channel, and then you can see where the new river mouth of the Don was as well, just underneath where it is. So here's a picture of what is there now. There are a couple of notable features with regard to fish habitat. The first one being the North Cove. This is a berm shoal that is open to the Keating Channel. The West Cove, this is an area enclosed with 2 carp exclusion gates, and the shoreline connecting these 2 coves. This area has rocky shoals extending about 5 to 10 meters. And in this photo, you can also see a large drainage channel across the middle of the site. This channel is currently being filled in, and it was just temporary. So for both coves, there was a lot of rock and anchored wood added to the system to provide fish habitat. The West Cove was planted with native aquatic vegetation, but the North Cove was not. So as part of the Fisheries Act authorization from Fisheries and Oceans Canada for this project, we completed fisheries monitoring. We used a variety of methods, including traps, electrofishing, and underwater video. As part of the authorization, we had to show that 3 native fish species were using each of the newly created habitats. And for the sake of time, I won't be going into all of the details of what we captured, but we did meet the conditions of the authorization for this part of the project and demonstrated that fish were using the newly built habitats. So here's just a short video of fish in the West Cove and some habitat features. The majority of the fish in this video are largemouth bass, a native warm water species. So this is a wetland that has 2 carp gates at the entrance of it. We install carp gates to keep adult common carp, a non-native fish species, from entering the wetland, as it would stir up the substrate, making the water turbid, which makes it harder for other fish to forage and for plants to grow. As for the North Cove that is open to the Keating Channel, we've had some notable catches in the area since it has been built, such as walleye and American eel, an endangered species. It's also worth noting that smallmouth bass, bluegill, and rock bass were not caught in any of the 144 samples collected pre-construction in the Keating Channel, but they were caught here post-construction. We knew these fish were in and around the harbor, but they weren't caught in the Keating Channel prior to this habitat being built. I do now want to focus on the New River Valley. So this photo was taken before the New River Valley and wetlands were flooded, showcasing the habitat features that are now submerged underwater. So many techniques from PLFPEI guided the creation of these habitats, and visible here are elements like submerged log tangles, rocky shoals, deep pools, and basking habitats. These features were carefully designed to support a variety of aquatic species, providing shelter, feeding areas, and spawning grounds. So to excavate the New River Valley and add those aquatic habitat features in, it was necessary to temporarily hold back the water in the inner harbor and the Don River. So this was achieved by installing 2 plugs, one at the north end and one at the west end of the river. In January of this year, water was gradually pumped into the newly constructed river valley, a process that took several weeks. Letting the water rush in all at once would be very exciting, but it would have been tough on the new riverbed materials and newly planted vegetation that was still establishing its roots and would likely be very dangerous with the staff that were tasked for that job. So currently, construction crews are still in the process of removing the remaining plugs at the north and west ends, but the west plug is almost fully removed, and as of a few weeks ago, there's an opening in the north plug, so allowing water flow through the river valley. So although the official post-performance monitoring program for this aspect of the project is set to begin in 2025, we were a little excited, and we've already started a few components of the monitoring program this year, which is good because fish were already quite interested in the area. For example, we have monitored the slip that is the new river mouth through electrofishing 45 times since 2015, and this is the first year we've ever captured northern pike and pumpkin seed in the slit. As part of our acoustic telemetry study in partnership with Fisheries and Oceans Canada and Carleton University, we've also been tracking fish more passively. So in spring of this year, we deployed a buoy that tracks tagged fish and monitors various water quality parameters in the new river mouth in real time. We've had records of northern pike, common carp, and largemouth bass using the area. Largemouth bass and common carp are also species that we've not seen in this area prior to 2024. So this equipment is a great way to monitor fish 24/7. However, I will note that we only tag certain species to track their fish movements, so we must continue with our active monitoring techniques as well. In 2024, we tagged 60 fish to be part of the study, bringing us to 110 species currently being tracked within the Toronto Harbor, and the study helps monitor fish response to habitat creation. So although the river valley was not fully connected when we made these discoveries, Canoe Cove, a coastal wetland created at the entrance of the new river mouth, was and likely contributed to us finding these fish utilizing the area so soon. So while our crews couldn't access the main river valley this year due to the construction work at both ends, the photo on the top right shows a bowfin that couldn't wait and successfully made it into the area past the construction crews and used the new habitat to spawn. Maybe hard to see, but the black area around the fish is actually thousands of baby bowfin. And then although the main river valley was off limits to us, our teams worked in the newly created wetlands, installing acoustic receivers to track fish movement and setting up temperature and dissolved oxygen analyzers for passive monitoring. These acoustic receivers store data for download once a year rather than providing the real-time updates. So each wetland within the river valley, like the West Cove, is equipped with carp exclusion gates to prevent adult common carp from entering the wetland while allowing native fish species to pass by freely. So in addition to the passive monitoring equipment deployed in the new wetlands, we've also conducted more active monitoring using minnow traps. This summer and fall, we set minnow traps in each of the new wetlands and captured a variety of species, including an abundance of fathead minnow and pumpkin seed, along with brown bullhead, brook stickleback, and round goby. It's important to note that minnow traps are specifically designed to capture smaller fish, such as minnows and shiners. Given that the vegetation is still establishing in these wetlands, we intentionally avoided using larger nets or deploying our electrofishing boat, which could potentially disturb the new plantings. This approach allowed us to gather data on fish populations while minimizing the impact on the habitat restoration process. A little laggy, unfortunately, on my end. So while crews were in the area, they also deployed underwater cameras to capture video footage of the aquatic life in the wetlands. So one notable observation was the presence of banded keelyfish, a fish that was not captured in our minnow traps. So this method of monitoring offers a non-invasive way to document fish populations and observe their behavior without disturbing the environment. In 2024, our group actually acquired new equipment to enhance our aquatic habitat assessments along the waterfront. So although the river valley was not yet connected to the Don River watershed at the time these surveys took place in August, we thought it'd be a good way to test out our new equipment and collect baseline conditions of the new wetlands prior to being connected. So this equipment uses sonar to collect data on submerged aquatic vegetation, bathymetry, and bottom hardness, which is then processed through a cloud system to generate maps and reports, providing data on things like biovolume of submerged aquatic vegetation. And then in terms of next steps, 2025 is the official start of the 5-year post-performance monitoring program as part of the environmental assessment for this project. This monitoring program is designed to ensure that the desired environmental outcomes related to the project are achieved and are effective. Basically, did we do what we said we were going to do? So building on this year's efforts, we're going to continue much of our current aquatic monitoring work while also introducing some new components. Some new additions will include water quality sampling and expanded aquatic vegetation and fish surveys to cover the new river valley. So these steps will help provide a more comprehensive picture of how the habitat is evolving and ensure that we're monitoring whether we meet our desired outcomes. And to wrap it up, I just wanted to say a special thank you to everyone who's contributed to the aquatic monitoring aspects of this project over the past few years. Also, a thank you to our field liaison representatives from MCFN for their partnership over the years. Apologies if I have unintentionally missed anyone on this slide. But that does conclude my aquatic monitoring updates. I'll hand it over to Brian, who will share some insights into the terrestrial aspects of the project.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Brynn. Yeah, so I conducted the terrestrial inventory of the new Portland's lands, and I just thought that maybe I'd take you through kind of to understand what I was looking at in terms of the plant situation there. So this project was about as close to a blank slate as you could possibly get in terms of what was already on the site compared to what was put into it. I want to draw your attention to a couple of these big numbers here. The first thing I'd like to point out is that there's a lot of species that were planted. Just in trees, there were 24 species of trees planted. There were over 20 species of shrubs, and there were over 75 species of herbaceous perennial plants, which is a pretty high diversity for any sort of restoration activity. The other number that I'd really like to point to is the number of herbaceous perennials that were planted. That's almost just about 750,000 individual plugs of planted material, which is just an astounding number. They had crews of people planting like tree planters in northern Ontario, except for herbaceous plants. This is a scale of project that I've personally never seen, and I don't believe is one that's been undertaken in very many other places. So that is pretty impressive. The other thing I was trying to get at when I said a blank slate is as Don was saying about the amount of soil remediation that was done. A lot of the soils that were put onto the site were pretty bare in terms of probably their seed bank, which meant that basically all of, or most of the plants that were brought into the site had to be planted. They didn't exist here before. It's also been a long time since any sort of natural vegetation was present on this site. So basically what I did for this vegetation survey was I collected invasive species data, basically to see where problematic species were so that we could deal with them in a timely fashion. Pretty much all of the species points that I took for these invasive species have already been earmarked for removal or management. And the other thing that I was tasked with doing was ecological land classification, which is actually in this image. This is an image of my field map that I took into the site with me. And you can see all the red lines there correspond to distinct vegetation communities that I delineated. So basically, what happens with ELC is plants grow in different assemblages or different communities, and so we're trying to outline those boundaries and then delineate those specifically. So for the ELC component, we delineated the communities in red pen, as I said, and we ranked the dominance of up to 4 species in each structural layer. So like the canopy, the middle, the lower, and the ground. And we estimate a percentage of physical cover of each layer and then provide the ELC code. Now I recorded 47 different vegetation communities of 17 distinct types. And overall, I had over 160 species that were recorded in those layers that I mentioned. Interesting to note, about 125 of those species were planted. So the vast majority of species that were identified on site were actually planted. Of the different plant communities, there were a lot of tree dominated or woody dominated communities, forest communities, 22 of those, which represented 4 types, and they were all plantations because everything was planted. It should be noted here that some of these communities were recorded as plantations, but functionally they're going to be something a little bit different. They're probably going to turn into something like a swamp community, but because they're planted, they get recorded in the ELC as plantations. Marshes, I had 12 of these communities representing six types. And another, just to reiterate this, is in this picture here, you can see pretty much every plant that's in this picture was planted like as an individual plug or plant stem, which is just, it's a phenomenal, like it's just crazy to me to think about that. There are also 5 aquatic communities that I delineated, including the actual river channel and the associated aquatic wetlands that were planted with aquatic material. So here's a side-by-side comparison of one particular area. You can see that the orange tarp is in both pictures. So this is overlooking the new island that was created in the Dawn Greenway. And the majority of the this site was planted last year. And you can see in the spring of 2024, you can see the individual lines of plants along the edge. So things are still very much establishing. And most of what I was doing this year was establishing a baseline conditions for this restoration activity. There's still a lot of change that's going to occur because as part of this project, there was a lot of weeding that was done to try to help the native plantings establish, and there was also a lot of watering that was done to help with the establishment as well. So once all of those activities stop, there's going to be a lot of shifting around of different species, because what planted is not necessarily what's going to be there long term on the landscape. So it's going to be really exciting over the next couple of years to see what kinds of shifts occur, and what actually kind of wins out, I guess. Hopefully a lot, because the plantings that were undertaken here were so diverse. Hopefully what ends up is a pretty diverse landscape. From what I saw, so the sedge marshes that they created, the Toronto Water folks took a lot of pride specifically in some of those sedge marshes. They looked pretty amazing to me. It was kind of like stepping into a wetland in northern Ontario, or more northern Ontario, as opposed to something on the Toronto waterfront. It was pretty special to see that. So hopefully, with the huge amount of effort that was put into this project, we're going to be able to see the fruits of that labor in the next couple of years.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for the excellent presentation, Maryam, Dawn, Brynn, and Brian. I'm sure there are lots of questions with over 100 people on the line, so please feel free to type your questions or comments in the chat or use the raise your hand function if you'd like to speak. I see Gavin has his hand up. Gavin, please go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to let you know that there were a few things that germinated from the seed bank that my friend Steve Smith had. They weren't very interesting. It was mostly soft stem bulrush. However, if you go south of there to Unwin Avenue, so it's south of the ship channel, there's a ditch on the south side of Unwin Avenue that I've known about since 1990. And there is still there are native populations of river bulrush there, and three square. So there are a couple of original wetland plants from the Ashbridges Bay Marsh that have hung on down there, a couple of species. So it might be worth considering propagating those and introducing them into the Donmouth wetlands.
That's great. Thanks for sharing, Gavin. Brian, any reactions to what Gavin has shared?
Not particularly, I guess. Yeah, I know that some of the species that the soft stem bulrush and cattails, some of those that were germinated from the seed bank. Basically, these are 200-year-old seeds that germinated. They were used in the plantings that took place in the wetlands. To the extent to which that was the case, I don't know, but I know that some of those plants were grown out for planting in this project.
It's really amazing to see the diversity of plant species, as you mentioned, Brian, in the site, and to see the fish coming back as well, Brynn. Perhaps a question to Maryam first is, the project has been touted as an ambitious engineering feat, but it's also a feat of, I think, project management and coordination too, with so many stakeholders involved and moving parts. Maryam, I wonder what were some of the key challenges that you encountered through this process, and how did you overcome them?
Oh, Sharon, that's a big question. I mean, I think that the biggest challenge was that we were all, Waterfront Toronto City and TRCA, working towards a really aggressive timeline of 2024 to open Portlands. And with a project of this magnitude and, like you said, the number of players, the huge amount of work going on and the budget, and then COVID hit. And they were actually Waterfront Toronto, because they're the ones who retain the constructor. They were able to continue construction, but it was a huge challenge to try to keep things moving on this. We were all in a way holding our breath to see what was going to happen, because the amount of work that needed to be done in the time frame was had little float, and so They were able to work around that with COVID, but it was a big challenge. And then the other thing that happened was post-COVID, there was a huge increase in the cost of materials, and then also just the ability to source many materials for construction. So that put kind of another wrench in the works. And in the end, they did have to raise dip into contingency and raise the project budget. I didn't mention it, but by the way, for everyone on the line, the cost of the Portlands is $1.3 billion. That's billion with a B. So it's probably one of the largest, if not the largest, urban redevelopment project in North America, brownfields redevelopment project in North America. So that was some of it. Just the complexity of putting together, like working on the detailed design. TRCA staff were excellent. So those technical experts who took some of the designers, which is a group out of Boston, were the major landscape designers who won the design competition for the Portlands, took them to some of our analog sites for other waterfront restoration sites. And I think just having the group think more in the manner that TRCA is used to doing, that we weren't trying to create I mean, there are going to be some public realm areas which are sculpted there, and certainly everything in the Portland's designed, even though it looks like a natural channel, but to have them more exposed to our natural restoration thinking and practices was something I think that was another, kind of another obstacle to tackle. So I think I would say those were some of the main things.
Thank you so much for sharing, Maryam. It is certainly a complex and evolving project, and I'm sure that there are other TRCA staff who've contributed to the project, and city and other staff as well. And if you'd like to share any of your perspectives and experiences, please feel free to chime in. And thanks for Gavin for sharing the picture of the river bulrush. Next question is to Dawn, perhaps. Dawn, are there any lessons learned from the complex excavation and remediation process that can potentially be applied elsewhere?
Thanks, Sharon. I would say the biggest lesson we learned was how deep these contaminants could go. What was surprising to everyone, because as I said, normally petroleum hydrocarbons float. So a typical remedial excavation would go down to the water table, which is pretty close to surface in this area, and then you'd stop and you're done. But these contaminants were being found at 12 meters or more below grade, to the extent that they couldn't get them all simply because they couldn't excavate that deep under these conditions, which necessitated some additional management measures. So I think that's something that bears consideration for other projects, remedial projects in kind of a harbor type setting where you've got these complex riverine systems. I think part of what was driving it is the complexity of the sediment deposition in the Ashbridges Bay wetland, the historic wetland that was there before. Combine that with all the fill that was thrown in over the years, right? And sometimes you end up, if that fill was contaminated because some of it was placed 150 years ago or 100 years ago, we didn't worry about petroleum hydrocarbons or metal concentrations in soil. It was just, hey, we fill in this unstable soil, we'll throw this on top, and then we can put a building on top of it. So a lot of those legacy contaminants ended up a lot deeper than people thought they would be. So that was probably the biggest challenge we had. I think as the investigation proceeded was trying to figure out what to do with these deeper contaminants and stay within the budget. Because it obviously increased the amount of soil that was excavated too and had to be managed.
Wonderful. Thanks for sharing, Dawn. Brad, please go ahead.
Hey, Dawn, just a quick question. The new island that's been created as a result of this, of the new river valley, it's going to have quite a bit of housing on it, and there's quite a push from some of the East End councillors and others to increase densities. What do you think they'll have to do with respect to the similar contaminants that they're going to find under those developments. Do you think it's at all feasible to cart that stuff off site, or are they going to not excavate and have everything above grade? What do you think?
It's going to be a combination, I think, Brad.
Huh.
I think there's going to be some excavation required because of parking, whenever, and deeper foundations. So you can't get away from all excavation. But so first of all, there's going to be some excavation down to a certain point. And in some cases, on-site treatment, where there's enough soil, they can afford on-site treatment. So there'll be some of that going on. Also, the biggest thing is probably vapor intrusion from the hydrocarbons. It's the primary route of exposure to the contaminants that are here. The metals, for example, they'll be well below the foundation, and it's a concrete foundation, so it's not going to get through. And those foundations will be fully waterproofed as well. So the biggest thing is probably going to be that vapor intrusion, and they'll have to have risk management measures associated with that, including venting and monitoring of vapor concentrations in parking garages and such. So it's not unknown to deal with condos or high-rise and deep foundations in these materials. The biggest risk is actually to the workers doing the work and putting in the foundation in the first place. And the risk management measures even include how to protect workers, whether it be workers working in the private space or in the public realm. Those considerations were taken into account as part of the community-based risk assessment. And I would also note that CBRA applies to the whole site and remains applicable to the entire site. So it gives everyone a framework to work from.
Okay. One thing that might be interesting for people is the similar to the shade studies that are done for any condo development or high-ish rise development. That's been a consideration on this project in terms of the development north of the new valley and the eventual, in, I don't know, 20, 30 years, development south of the valley, making sure that we don't construct buildings that will result in massive shadow on this brand new, like you heard from Brian, how much effort was put into the plantings and restoration approaches, making sure that we don't shade things out. So there's been quite a bit of thought from the City of Toronto in terms of embedding those kind of protections in, and it's a very big consideration with these new this new push for increased densities, increased heights. So there's a bit of a consideration there in terms of what's the potential impact of higher densities. So they're actually going into what's the shadow impact on this constructed wetland, what's the shadow impact on that constructed wetland. So there's some really interesting stuff going on down there.
Agreed. And it's the developments to the south that will obviously have the biggest impact on the valley, with the sun primarily coming from the south there or overhead.
Fascinating. Thanks for sharing, Brad and Don. Rick, I see your hand up. Please go ahead.
Hi, Sharon. I just wanted to mention this is it's been an amazing project to work on. This is what I like to call a generational project. I started right from the beginning, so almost 15 plus years ago, we started on this project. And we should mention that a lot of the folks that initiated this large project and really got it going have since retired. And I have since, and a bunch of others, including Don, you're my generation, Don, and we're probably closer to retirement than we like to admit. But we worked through the middle of this and the middle portion of this, and it's a great legacy to see this so far along. But once we retire, there's still a whole another generation of folks that are coming up, and including Brynn and Brian and others who are going to be working on this for another 10 to 15 to 20, potentially 20 years through the successional monitoring components and watching this park build out. So it is definitely a generational project, and it's just been a great pleasure working on it and helping with the design and helping with the monitoring and just seeing the success of a lot of this. A lot of these components is just incredible, and it's like I said, it's quite a legacy to sort of leave behind. And so anyway, I just wanted to say I've put my 2 cents in. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing, Rick, and kudos to everyone who has been involved and to you and the team. And I love the tours habitat creation, seeing that put in place as well in this area is really amazing to see. Perhaps we'll go to Sala next.
Hi, Don. I have a question to you that you mentioned that some contaminants is still left at the site and they may create that vapor intrusion. Just my question is that is there any evaluation done that say that some of these contaminants are naturally being attenuated? Or I mean that they have a potential attenuation capacity. So in future, they can be degraded as desired, or you feel that they need some kind of remediation or monitoring for a long time?
There's some bioremediation that's happening, given redox potentials that we've seen, but it's a little hard to judge whether the natural attenuation is successful because the concentrations were initially quite high and the material's been there for 100 years in some cases. So, and it's still there. So that natural attenuation has been slow. But now that we've knocked the concentrations back and got most of the contaminants out of the way, there's some hope that natural attenuation will happen over a period of time. And that's part of the monitoring as well. There's, in addition to the plant monitoring and the fish monitoring, there's also groundwater monitoring and surface water monitoring happening.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Sala. Thanks, Don. Perhaps we'll end with a lightning round for all of our speakers. If you can come back to the site in 5 to 10 years, what would you like to see? Maybe we'll start with Brynn.
Yeah, thanks, Sharon. I think I'd just like to see more fish diversity. We're already starting to see it, but it'd be great to see more fish diversity, fish in different life stages. So we're showing that fish are using the area to reproduce and for different areas of their life. And yeah, just that we kind of continue to see the techniques in TWARs are working across the waterfront. We've already proved it with so many other projects along the Toronto waterfront. So it'd be exciting to see that they're also working here.
Wonderful. Brian, how about you? In 5 to 10 years, what would you like to see?
Yeah, I think I'd like to see a as diverse a plant community as possible, and as native of a plant community as possible. That would be my primary hope, is that a lot of just that, to see how many species actually survive and flourish and reproduce in that landscape.
Wonderful. Don, how about you?
I would have to say, turn it over and say, I'd like to see some development here because, you know, we put all this effort into creating this island to spur development close to the downtown, and it feeds into this develop where we already have infrastructure, where we already have employment and everything else, and servicing and transit. So instead of developing these greenfield areas, we need to see housing come into these areas. So that's what although I'm a hydrogeologist, I want to see something come of this besides the beautiful river valley, have some people there to enjoy it.
And I see Brad would like to chime in. Brad.
Yeah, just to build on that. Sorry, I joined 10 minutes in, so you might have already discussed this, but we aren't just talking about bringing the new island out of the floodplain. and portions of the Portlands out of the floodplain. It's also what's known as East Harbor, and actually the southwest portion of Leslieville, like all the way up to Queen Street. All of those areas, from the work going on with this project for flood remediation, and then some other protections along Broadview. It takes essentially that whole corner of Toronto out of the floodplain. So it's the development Don's talking about isn't just the island north of the valley. It's that whole corner of what some people would call downtown. I wouldn't call it downtown, but some people would. So.
Thanks, Brad. And as Brad mentioned, there's so much to unpack here, and we hope to bring you another Lunch and Learn in the new year to explore further the building of the Portlands and the surrounding area. But Maryam, last word to you. In 5 to 10 years, what would you like to see?
Well, I mean, I really would like to see successful habitats and that we met all our EA objectives. So first and foremost, that, we are doing something for the natural environment here. But my hope is also that as the parks and public realm aspects come into operation, that we're going to see it be a vibrant place that people will be able to, tip their canoe in and enjoy all of the different park features that are under construction and about to be built. We're going to have things that are representing a little microcosm of various areas of Ontario, including a little Badlands area. It's really exciting stuff. And as I mentioned, if anyone's interested in finding out more about all those public realm features, please have a look at that presentation that Waterfront Toronto gave at our last board meeting. And I guess lastly, I'd like to say I hope that this is, because they've incorporated so many Indigenous design features in there, I hope that spurs people to have a curiosity about our Indigenous cultures that are still here now, that predated us all, and that it inspires people to learn more about those rich cultures.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for the excellent presentation discussion, Maryam, Don, Brynn, and Brian. In closing, I'll just share my last few slides. This is our last Lunch and Learn of 2024 and the 50th Lunch and Learn in our series since we started in 2020. In the new year, we'll continue to plan some more exciting Lunch and Learns, including one that I mentioned. We'll continue to explore the transformation of Toronto's waterfront on building the Portlands, so please stay tuned for more. And just as a friendly reminder, registration for these Lunch and Learns are required for TRCA staff through the Learning Management System in Dayforce. We also have a hub space for scientific knowledge sharing, which you can access by going to Hub Spaces in Staff Hub. Here you'll be able to find past Lunch and Learn recordings and a lot more scientific knowledge, so please do check it out. We are using the Hub to share Lunch and Learn recordings, so I will send an email with a link to the recording once it is available on the Hub in the next few days. And if you missed our last Lunch and Learn with Tiziana and Jonathan, you're in luck, because they've been invited to present at OPPEI's Oak Ridges District webinar this Friday at noon to talk about integrating multi-species connectivity into urban planning. You can register for the session at OPPEI events, and thanks to Lolita from the City of Pickering for coordinating this OPPEI session. Once again, a big thanks to Maryam, Don, Brynn, and Brian for the great presentation discussion, and to all of you for attending. If you have any questions or suggestions for future Lunch and Learns, please don't hesitate to reach out. Thank you, everyone, and take care.